Hello everybody, welcome to our very first Meet Me at Mahogany. My name is Freddie Wakewalker. I'm the Artistic Director of Mahogany Opera and I'm going to be your host this evening. I'll give a quick visual description of myself. I have red blondish hair and a rather red beard, which I'm afraid is turning a little bit grey at the sides. And my walls are green behind me. And I, like many people, are trying to convey a sense of academic, intellectual rigor. And so I've got lots of books on shelves behind me. It's great to see so many of you here this evening. Thank you so much for joining. As I say, it's our very first Meet Me at Mahogany. This event has, of course, been born out of the current situation and our need to connect in this extraordinary time of isolation. But we consider Mahogany Opera to be a place of conversation and discussion, of research, of transparency, of opening up the creative process and demystifying opera, particularly with our various stages program, but across our whole work. So Meet Me at Mahogany feels like a very natural progression for us. Somehow, and I'm looking forward hugely to the conversation this evening, but we're hoping to do these every couple of months or so. So I'm hoping that these conversations will enrich our work at Mahogany hugely. Caroline McCohen, our fundraiser, described it the other day as a space for transformational thinking, and I liked that very much. That was a very beautiful description. So now I'm going to introduce Charlotte, Toria and Amble. Toria and Amble applied to our various stages program last year. We had 150 applications or something, but what struck me and us about their piece was that, well, not only was it a story that felt very, very urgent and needing to be told, but the way in which Toria and Amble wanted to tell this story felt particularly exciting and innovative. And I had the pleasure then of workshopping or having a couple of days of workshopping with them and discussing their piece. And I found it hugely inspiring. And as ever, as the mentor, I learned far more from them as they got from me, I'm sure. Toria Banks, I'm going to try and introduce the three of them in short sentences, but it's basically impossible because they're such polymaths and they've done such a huge amount. But Toria Banks is a director, a writer, an acting teacher, producer, a dramaturg, and she runs together with two others, Hera, which is, in my opinion, one of the most exciting and interesting opera companies in the UK at the moment. Amble Skuse is a composer and a sound artist. If I try and describe the scope of her work, it will take me too long, but she works with acoustic instruments, electronic instruments. She works with sound design, with archive, verbatim, you name it, she's worked with it. She's also studying for a PhD at the moment, exploring how composers and performers can utilize technology as a tool, disabled composers and performers, I should say, can utilize technology as a tool for their compositions and performing. And finally, Dr. Charlotte Armstrong, who's going to guide the discussion this evening. Charlotte has a PhD in music from York University, and she runs a blog called operaandisability.com. Her work has focused a lot with Opera North, and I'm just very, very excited about being able to invite all three of you to speak to us this evening. And so without further ado, but can I remind you just to make a little visual description of yourselves, I'll hand over to Charlotte.
Thanks, Freddie. Wow, it's amazing to see so many people here. So yeah, visual description. I'm a white woman in my late 20s. I have sort of shoulder length, reddish brown hair. I'm wearing a green and white stripy top and some brown dungarees, and I'm sat in a quite a boring office room with a wooden mirror behind me and a white door behind me. Amble, do you want to give your description?
Hey, I work with sound, you know. Great start. I'm Amble. I've got short brown hair. I've got a chunky brown blue jumper on because the window's open. There's a bright red wall behind me and a wooden bed frame and a picture of the sea, painting of the sea. And yeah, thanks all for coming. Toria?
Hi, I'm Toria. I am a white woman in her early 40s, alarmingly. I have shoulder length blonde hair, blue eyes, and I'm wearing a black jumper with a floral shirt underneath. I'm in a sort of beige room, and you can see some check curtains at my window behind me and not much else. And yeah, thanks very much for coming.
Cool. So I think the best place really for us to start would be for you guys to say maybe a little bit about, we ask these questions of everybody, where the idea came from, what were your kind of original intentions, and kind of set the scene for us.
Do you want to start, Toria?
Yeah, go on then.
Go on then.
Yeah, about 2 years ago, Amble was doing some research for a different piece for her PhD, and for a different music commission, and she was doing a series of interviews with disabled people, and we have some mutual friends and we found each other on Facebook, and I was one of the subjects of her interview. I'm one of the interviewees, and that's how we met and where this began, which is a really interesting genesis for me, because often participants and members of the community that we're listening to make work and artists are seen as very separate categories, but it's always really pleased me that I am one of the participants as well as one of the creators of the work. So Amble made this amazing thing where she interviewed people and she made this song out of verbatim text, and I really loved it. And then the performance that she hoped it was heading towards sort of fell through, and something came up at the Opera House with their new project in gender, where they were looking for proposals by all female teams, and I rang her and said, I think this is not opera, do you want to do it? So that was the very beginning, and then although that didn't happen, that got us talking, and by the time that we came to apply to Mahogany's various stages, just over a year ago, we had a much more kind of solid concept about what we wanted to do, and we're just kind of beginning to arrive at a libretto. So it's sort of. Do you want to add anything, love?
No, I think that's pretty much what happened.
Cool.
Next.
So I don't know, I guess for a lot of people who've seen the opera, it might be quite surprising to know that it was kind of conceived of before COVID-19, and obviously the pandemic has created sort of more awareness of sort of some of the structural inequalities faced by disabled people in the UK. So how has the past year impacted on the work, both sort of from an artistic perspective, but also from a logistical perspective, kind of practical perspective?
It's actually been it's kind of been a reverse surprise for us, because I spend a lot of time at home and in bed, and going anywhere completely wipes me out. I think we always knew that most of it would be done remotely, and we'd built that into part of our practice, that, you know, the idea that opera has to be done in a room for 6 hours in London with everybody present, you know, for weeks on end, just wasn't going to be possible for me to take part, and for some of the other performers as well. And so we'd already thought about how we would structure the project to make sure that nobody got really ill pushing themselves into a model that didn't work for them. So then when the pandemic happened, it was kind of a reverse surprise, because it was like suddenly, if you've got this bell curve of normal and we were sort of here, it was like the whole bell curve shifted and we were right in the middle of it. And everyone else was like, oh my God, how do we live like this? And we were like, oh no, that's how I live anyway. Okay, great, carry on. So we got the funding from Creative Scotland and we put the application in before COVID was a thing. And then just after the lockdown, we got the notification saying, we've awarded you the funding, but you need to fill in this other form about how you're going to adapt your entire project under this new thing we're calling lockdown, which nobody really knew what it was or how long it was going to last or anything at that point. And everyone was very much in kind of a panic mode. And we sort of looked at it and went, don't really have to change much. So we were going to rehearse in Aberdeen and do the show live at Sound Festival, but we already knew that a lot of our rehearsals would be online, and we already knew that a lot of the material we wanted to work with would be online, and we'd be streaming stuff live because a lot of our participants and our audience would be at home, and asking them to come to a theatre in Aberdeen was sort of a ridiculous notion for an opera about disability. So in a sense, it's sort of, we just changed the levels of what would be live and what would be online a little bit, but a lot of that structure was already in place, really. So yeah, it was like the bell curve of normal shifted, so we were like right in the middle of it, and we were just really lucky, because if anything else had happened that required us to run for our lives from zombies or whatever, we would have been in real trouble. But as it was, we all had to stay at home and do things by video, which is exactly how we were living anyway. So yeah, it was weird. It was a really weird sensation, but it kind of worked in our favor in terms of how we were going to make the show. Yeah.
It still bears repeating, I think, that Amble and I have never met. If you think that met means being in a room, but I think it's becoming increasingly obvious that met doesn't mean has been in a room, because we've just made an opera. But like, I haven't met any of the team in a room except Libby, the design intern, because we met once before at another thing. The room that I'm currently in, the desk I'm currently at, is where the entire project happened for me.
Yeah, and that's become the norm for a lot of people this year, hasn't it? But I guess you guys are kind of used to working in that way, or have been used to working in that way.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much I do everything in my bed from a laptop, and sometimes that bed is in Scotland, and then sometimes I go to Germany to do a residency, but in reality that just means that the bed is in Germany, and I go and wave at people in a museum for an hour once a week, and then get back to the bed in Germany and carry on with whatever they want me to make, or Canada or wherever. So yeah, that I'm very much like, I have a suitcase, all my gear fits in a small carry-on suitcase, and then I just, my bed is my studio. So
and for me, I've worked in opera for a long time in various ways. For the first, I've been disabled for over 20 years. I spent about a decade trying to work in a normal way and basically hiding it. And that was much harder than this. Obviously the pandemic is terrible, but for me, working with an all disabled company and during a pandemic has allowed me really for the first time to work in a way that is fully accessible for me. Because, and this shouldn't be true, but it is true, because I have the excuse, for want of a better word, of it being better for other people and not being something I'm just selfishly asking for myself. But it, for somebody who's been disabled and an artist for quite a long time before I was a disabled artist in a kind of out and disclosed and conscious way, this entire situation has basically allowed me to work in a way that is much easier for me, kind of for the first time.
And how would you say that your way of working on this project could be kind of translated and adapted by different companies? Do you think you've come up with a kind of best practice like model here, or the things that you would change?
I think I don't know that there's a best practice model. I don't know that that's obviously there are things that are best practice, like in terms of gathering information about what your entire company needs in terms of access and then planning around it. But the thing that you end up with when you do that will always be different, because the access needs will always be different. And I think that's true for non-disabled people as well. You know, I think people have recognised over the last year that even if you're not disabled, like, life is still complicated. A very, very tiny fraction of the population are like totally autonomous, financially secure, medically secure, physically secure kind of people who can work full time without any consideration to kind of caring responsibilities, or, you know, that we shouldn't run everything around those people because there are so few of them. So that is the best practice, really, is kind of ask people what they need. Don't ask them why they need it. Don't make them prove it. Don't ask them for a diagnosis. And then plan your process around them. And then our first day of online rehearsals was basically entirely about process and about working out how we would work and how we would get what we needed and how we would record and how we would communicate with each other. And there was time for that. And I think maybe there's always time for that.
Yeah, it seems like a really sensible thing to do.
But I think people are so worried about seeming like they don't know how it's done properly. You know, that there's a way that opera is rehearsed and there's a way that theatre is rehearsed, and you have to know how to do it properly. And therefore, on day one, the important thing is to turn up and show that you know how it's done. And if we could get past that to working out, to being open to, like, we don't know how we're going to do it this time in its most kind of productive and human way that isn't going to like damage anyone that's involved in the project. I think that is something that everybody could be doing.
Yeah, and it's part of my PhD is looking at how we can think of processes in a more kind of disabled way. And, you know, disabled, like Toria says, includes, you know, if you've got caring responsibilities or kids you've got to pick up from school, or, you know, whatever's going on in your life, that, you know, we tend to work with these sort of hierarchical models where somebody who's at the top decides what works and then imposes that on those further down the chain. But we have to remember the kind of people who get to the top are a certain type of person that maybe doesn't have those other complications in their lives, so doesn't understand that those complications are just reality and not something to be hidden. And, you know, there's all sorts of reasons for that in terms of like moving away from the sort of patriarchal nuclear family where one is a caregiver and one is the owner and blah, blah, blah. But this idea of becoming a more networked society where actually every time a group of people come together, they create a new network and negotiate what that looks like. And you move a little bit to one side for somebody and somebody moves a little bit the other way. And each time we do that, we create the thing anew. And that sounds like it requires a lot of negotiation, and it does, but I think it's a really interesting non-hierarchical way of making work. So it was something I wanted to bring into this show, and we've done it artistically, but also in terms of process, in terms of like how we work together. We tried as much as we could to give people the autonomy to define their own needs and to define their own working methods and their own creative choices, and we'll probably get onto that later. But it was very much about honouring each person as they were, as opposed to saying, this is how we need you to be, can you switch that on for the next 6 hours? So just sort of, yeah, like Toria said, just trying to create a thing from the people who were there, as opposed to trying to fit people into a model that we had arbitrarily decided to use.
Yeah, I'd definitely like to come back to that idea of the kind of non-hierarchical model in a little bit, but I was thinking if perhaps before we move on to that, just staying on the idea of like the kind of the practical aspects of this work, Can you maybe say a little bit about your casting process and like how you went about selecting like your team and your performers?
I wouldn't say we had a casting process, and I do want to be quite clear about what I mean by that, because that could sound really bad. And I also don't think that that's necessarily right for every project. Like, as a company, Hera have done other projects where we've put out an extremely open call, and actually there were some creative roles in this which were about putting out an extremely open call and kind of seeing what came back. The cast and the musicians were kind of baked into the project from its inception and from it being conceived of, and I don't think that could have worked any other way. Like, I think it was very much composed for the voices and the whole persons and beings of Victoria and Steph as singers. Victoria Orowari plays, for those who haven't seen it, plays Lynn, a nurse who works for the Department of Work and Pensions, and Steph, the sort of disabled protagonist of the plays Hannah, the disabled protagonist of the show. And it was composed by Amble partly, as I say, around them as individuals and also around them as an opera singer working with a folk singer. And so those kind of bigger musical identities and their very personal identities were a big part of it. Likewise, because of the improvisatory nature of some of the composition, like, we worked with people that Amble had really strong existing relationships with and who had been in on the kind of conception of the idea. Sonia Laurie and Steph, again, who is the harpist as well as the singer. And Clarence Adu, who played, I won't quite say an instrument, but played a sort of sampler computer interface that Amble made for him. So in that instance, he came before defining what the instrument was that he would play. And to work with a disabled cast in a kind of truly inclusive way, it feels like it makes sense for that to be that way round. There are other ways of doing that, of putting a company together, but I think you have to put the company together and then you have to go, what is the amazing thing that these people can do? Not, and like, how can we use their talent? Not, you know, oh, let's do an opera, let's think about casting some disabled people and then kind of worry about the things that they won't be able to do. Like, that's not, it's not a kind of helpful. So on the other hand, we put out a very open call for a digital producer to work with, and we were keen to work with somebody who identified as disabled for that. And then the only sort of non-disabled part of the creative team was Laura Spark, who made our captions. And that's because, and I hope people who've seen it agree, but she seemed absolutely the right person for that.
Ooh. I think we've got frozen Toria.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree that Laura Spark's captioning was really amazing and it fit perfectly with it.
Yeah. And just to kind of relay that back to what we were saying before about the networked ensemble, it was about knowing the musicians and knowing who they were, what their identities were, what they brought, what their musical identity was about, and working with what existed rather than building a role and then squishing somebody into it, if that makes sense. So it's it's the same principle really with the organisation, squishing somebody into a role, or as a casting process, squishing somebody into a role. We sort of tried to work from the core people, the humans, the musicality of those humans, and then that kind of sparked ideas for how the show would work. So yeah, it's like building up from the humans as opposed to creating the thing and then putting the humans into it, which is something that I think a lot of disabled people struggle with because we don't fit into those preconceived ideas and boxes of what you should and shouldn't be able to do. I think we've lost Toria completely. She seems to have vanished off my screen.
Yeah, she's vanished off mine as well.
Shall I WhatsApp her?
Hi,
Oh,
I think I'm back.
She's back.
My internet cut out. I'm really sorry. That has happened a lot.
Okay, Poppet. Nice
I'm
to
gonna
see you.
move you back to my bit where I can see you, Toria.
Yeah, I can't see
There
you
we
at
go.
all now. I think you're on page 3 these days. Where have you gone? Oh, she's at page 3. Hiya.
Okay, right, back to where we were. So yeah, like a lot of the things you're saying there about kind of the way that you've built up this process, I think a lot of it seems like it would rely on quite a lot of trust. So I was going to ask how you kind of go about establishing trust when you're working in like a completely digital space. Like it's different from being in a room with someone.
I think a lot of what we achieved as a company was down to Toria's excellent interpersonal directing leadership skills, because there were times when it was exceptionally challenging. Just, you know, to the point, you know, on a really simple level, the singers were in isolation, so we couldn't even get a technician to them to help them set up and record. So we're getting singers to not only learn their roles and rehearse them over Zoom and record them over Zoom and take direction over Zoom, but also to set up their own microphones and be responsible for recording their own content and checking it for background noise and making sure they're using the right interface. And, you know, it's a lot. It is a lot to ask of anybody. It was super challenging, and I think the only way we got through that was because Toria had the skills to hold it all together, and she really came through on a number of occasions where the rest of us were like properly within. Toria kind of managed to pull it all together and to get us like back in a really good place. So that's the only thing I can say, is that Toria did it.
Really lovely of you to say, Amble. I think patience. I think it's really some of it is simply that we're used to thinking of offices and our computers and Zoom as spaces for administration, and that you just have to remember that you're not doing that. You're not having like a multiple hour-long meeting, and it isn't about getting through bullet points or like ticking things off the agenda. You're trying to like be creative together, and so I think remembering that, and I think talking things through, and giving space for like social chat, for the chat that you would have in, you know, in the cafe at lunchtime if you were at an actual rehearsal, still needs to happen. Taking breaks, gosh, I don't know about everybody else, like even without chronic illness, people talk a lot about getting tired on Zoom. We worked in 45-minute chunks, whereas I would normally work in a 90-minute chunk, maybe in a rehearsal room. So we literally took breaks twice as often. I do think it also, like, I don't want to discourage people from making work with disabled artists at all, but like this is quite a difficult subject that's very personal for disabled people, and this is a very difficult time for disabled people. And I don't think if it hadn't been that Amble and I are both speaking about that from a place of knowledge and we're going through it as well, I think it's asking a lot for people to share their vulnerability by being kind of fully present as their disabled selves, rather than just trying to kind of mask and be as kind of conventionally professional as possible. I think that trust has to come from Amble and I kind of modeling quite kind of difficult amounts of honesty. And that that was one of the things that was really special about the process, but is also hard.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting that you say that, and you know, we hear a lot about trigger warnings and content warnings these days, and there are some kind of naysayers and some people who are kind of maybe overly cautious with them. But I think we both felt that every time we worked with a new person, because it wasn't, you know, we recorded a lot of the singers before we started with the musicians, and it was really important to take that time to say, we know this is really hard. This is hard for us. This is going to maybe hard for you. And if at any point this is hard for you, that's okay. And we expect it to be hard for you. And there's no expectation of what you should be able to achieve by the end of the day. Yeah, there are things we want to get done because schedule, TikTok, but actually we need to know you're okay. So don't push yourself through things. If you're struggling, tell us. We had some money in the budget to pay for like support and counselling if anybody found that they needed that as a result of what we were doing. So we were very conscious that we were asking people to do something very difficult, and that we were very grateful for the work that they were doing for us, and that it was okay for them to find it difficult and to have, you know, if they needed time off, or they needed a meltdown, or they needed to talk about something, or they just, you know, we even had flexibility in the piece. So it was a case of like, if you don't want to sing this, if you don't want to play over these samples, that's fine. If this is too much, then I'll just write something else. I'll get a computer to do something. You know, it's not set in stone to the point where I want to distress the people I'm working with. So there was always that sense that we could be ultimately flexible. And of course that comes down to, you know, that then places extra responsibility on Toria and I to deal with those things if they do come up. But I think that was something that we wanted to keep as open, as flexible as possible, is that, do you know what, if this isn't working and it doesn't work for you and it is difficult for you as a singer, as a performer, as an artist, that's okay, and we'll just find a way around it. Like, it's not a failure, it's not a big problem, like it's not like a contract breaking issue, it's just, I don't want to do this, that's fine. So there was a lot of that involved as well. And like Toria says, the chit chat and like trying to laugh about things, and especially in the sections that were really heavy, just making sure that we had a bit of a laugh and were silly, and, you know, just trying to make sure that we cared about each other as friends just as much as we cared about the product and the thing we were making. I think, I hope the performers felt like that. I don't know, I hope so.
Yeah, I mean, you talked a little bit there about the fact that it's quite a kind of emotionally taxing and at times like quite traumatizing topic. And that's certainly true, I'm sure, for like the performers, but I mean, for you guys as the people creating it as well, I mean, it must have been hard to work with. There's moments in the script that are quite jarring and really uncomfortable, so there must have been times that it was hard to work with that material.
I mean, absolutely, yes. And just to save Amble saying it, the fact that in order to compose in the way that she did with the vocal lines, it meant that she had to listen to the recording of that benefits assessment over and over and over and over and over again, and that's a really, really hard thing to do. I would say the thing that made it both harder and easier, and also necessary, is that Amble and I have the same neurological disability and the same neurological disability as Hannah in the show. So none of the really awful stuff in this came as a surprise to us. We've both lived all of it. Like yes, it's upsetting, but sometimes when non-disabled friends and family have watched this and been like, oh my gosh, I can't believe somebody would say that, or I can't believe they did that, or I can't, and you're like, I mean, it's a relief really, because people do it all the time. So yes, it was hard, but I think I struggle more with I struggle more with what disabled people refer to as inspiration porn, with disabled narratives that are about how disabled people are like so wonderfully inspiringly in their persevering and their overcoming of obstacles, and look how they're always, you know, cheery despite everything awful that society does to them. And a certain amount of a kind of diversity and inclusion approach to disability from kind of major arts organisations can have a sort of persistent air of that about it, that the point of being inclusive about disability is how inspiring disabled people are, and then that becomes the role. Yeah, as somebody whose disability involves like fatigue and pain, and a host of other extremely inconvenient symptoms, like that is much harder to get on board with, you know. Look, we did disability, here's some smiling children in wheelchairs. Like that can be a lot harder to take as the representation that you're offered. Sorry, this is like I can't see everybody in the room at the moment, or I wouldn't probably speak as freely, I forget, but
that's what we're here for.
You know, this is definitely the most honest thing that I've made about the condition that I have, even though the material isn't it's not an autobiographical show. In a way, it's the closest thing that I've done to something that is, and so actually enormously freeing to be able to talk about that freely, both in a creative work and with a group of people that I was making it with.
Yeah. I did find it incredibly difficult, and I think I put off doing the notation of the interview a lot longer than I perhaps should have done, which then meant I had to do it all in like every single day. I was listening, and the recording, because it has to be on a cassette tape because the DWP live in the 1980s, so it's a really bad recording, and you're really struggling to hear what she's saying, and you're really struggling to hear the kind of pitch and rhythm and intonation, and you've just got these awful phrases on loop going round and round in your head, and you're trying to play them back on the piano. And I mean, if I was a better musician, I probably could have done it quicker. But yeah, I found that a process, like Toria said. I did find that like really difficult and upsetting, and emotionally it was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. On the other hand, doing the interviews with the disabled people is the best thing I have ever done. The best thing, like sitting down and spending like 30 hours just chatting to these awesome humans who have perspectives that really helped me to see ways of thinking about my life, see ways of thinking about society, ways of taking power back, to have met those people and for them to have given me their time. I mean, it was absolutely life-changing, and it's going to sound inspiration porn, but those people are just the best people. The people we interviewed are incredible, fascinating people, and we don't hear those voices enough. People who live with disabilities, people who are limited to their homes, people who live with pain or fatigue, they have ways of understanding the world that non-disabled people never get to experience. Mm-hmm. And that's really interesting. That perspective is fascinating as a philosophy, as a way of thinking about the world, as a way of understanding yourself, as a way of understanding mortality and human existence. And yet we edit it out because non-disabled people, well, why? They don't want to hear it. They don't know it's there. It frightens them that we have all these narratives about disability being wrong or bad, or you don't talk about it, or it's tragedy, or it's evil, or you somehow deserve it, or yeah, all this weird kind of cultural, sociological stuff. Means we don't listen to those stories half as much as we should do, because if we had listened to disabled people, we wouldn't all be finding lockdown so difficult, because disabled people have been locked down since forever and they've got so many strategies for dealing with it, and yet nobody bothered to ask them, how do you do that? How do you stay inside all the time? You know, it's just taken for granted that disabled people can do it and non-disabled people will find it challenging. Of course, that's nonsense. Disabled people learn how to do it. over years and years of practice and frustration and trial and error and stuff like that. So I would say the interviews and working with the interviews and working with those people and hearing the way they talk about their lives is just the most brilliant thing I've ever got to do. It's just been fab. The notating of that bloody DWP interview is the worst thing I've ever had to do, and it nearly drove me mental. Like, I was properly emotionally all over the place for weeks on end. Yeah, it's been intense.
Sounds like extremes of the creative process, definitely.
It was big, man. It was big.
Yeah.
It was real. Okay, where's Toria? I've lost her again. Are you here? There she is. I'm going to drag you back onto page 1.
I'm here.
So I think we're going to move to a short break, just so that Paul can have a break. And I would quite like to pick up on some of those ideas about like the narrative and stuff when we return. But I think we've got a short clip from the opera to play.
And are you working just now? Yes. And is it from home that you work? Yes. And are you self-employed or is somebody employing you? Self-employed. You drink alcohol? Really? You smoke? No. You drink alcohol? Right. And do you drive? How often do you drive in a week? Maybe once or twice, 'cause often I don't feel like safe to drive. And I crashed my car in February, so now I'm careful not to drive if I don't feel safe. Like my cognitive, like my cognitive, like my cognitive, yeah. So now I'm careful not to drive if I don't feel safe. Like my cognitive, like my cognitive, like my cognitive, yeah. So that's probably like 5 or 6 days a week where I won't leave the house. How did you get to assessment today? My friend brought me.
I'm not disabled, I'm fine, I'm not disabled, I'm fine, I'm not disabled, I'm fine. I'm not disabled, I'm fine. Maybe I'm actually disabled.
Chronically ill people around me were saying, no, that word is terrible, that word means giving up. And I was like, no, this word means...
For me, it's just kind of like, it's not a bad thing to be disabled.
It's quite difficult to admit to yourself that you are disabled. And there's a whole sort of way of being and a way of thinking.
I mean, they use phrases like catastrophic disability.
I was really scared to have to it was like, I didn't know how to take on all of that, like
going, no, disability isn't a dirty word. This is a thing that you can grab with both hands and use to make your life better.
Be able to welcome these, on some level, fairly terrible things into your life.
It's not a positive experience, but it can give positive things.
Disabled people are mega experts on resilience. It's fuck resilience.
It was this, superhuman, on a pedestal view of disability.
I have an impairment, but I don't have a disability because that thing does not exist.
It's fuck resilience.
I am disabled in my career, in my economic chances.
Be able to welcome these, on some level, fairly terrible things into your life.
Holding joy and despair in tension.
We get on with it because we don't have the choice.
Because there are just certain little nuances about our existence.
Not great, but at the same time, it's not a tragedy. And I think that like we like to sort of see disability as a tragedy, as like a tragic story.
Is the old school narrative of vulnerability, which is deeply harmful to disabled people.
Because like my life is never going to be ordinary. I can't do ordinary things. My life is never going to be ordinary. I can't do ordinary things.
Some silent applause there from from some of these viewers. Amble, do you want to maybe say a little bit about the clip that we just heard, and kind of what we're hearing there, and how you kind of came up with it?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a combined effort, really, because Toria curated the interviews, which was a mammoth job. So I had about 30 hours of interviews with, I think we had 23 people. So some of us, we just waffled on for like an hour. And then we got the interviews transcribed. And I picked out the bits that I liked for the previous piece that I'd been working on. And then we interviewed some more people. And basically, Toria got a Dropbox full of 30 hours worth of chat and had to pick the bit she wanted and kind of expertly curated. So each chorus has a different feel, a different message, a different mood, a different narrative, a different kind of subject matter. And she picked out phrases from those interviews that kind of wove together to give a sense of that. And then I went back through those transcripts and found those clips in the audio and brought them out and made them into the soundscapes. And some of them have the soundscapes with, I think with that one, we had some lovely Sonia Alori playing clarinet in the background. And some of them are done over an electronics background. Some of them are pre-programmed and some of them were improvised live by Clarence Adu. So the clips that Toria had chosen were all loaded into the sampler that I'd made for Clarence that he could control with his head mouse. So he has a tube which he can move a cursor around on the screen, and he can click and he can double click on it. And so I built this screen interface and loaded the samples in, so each number had a clip behind it, and then he was able to trigger those samples and turn it into a soundscape. So some of the soundscapes were improvised live by Clarence, choosing which samples you'd hear and in what order you'd hear them, and how many times they'd repeat and things like that. So there's various different approaches to making the soundscape. Some of them Toria was really clear she wanted those quotes in that order, and some of them she was very kind of open and gave us like 20 or 30 quotes that Clarence could choose from. So really I think the artistry in it, in the subject matter and the conversations, is due to Toria's editing. And then I just worked with that to make it into a soundscapes. Toria?
Yeah, just to talk a little bit more about working with Clarence Adu, because that was an amazing part of the project for me, is that as a librettist composer team, the fact that we were able to give samples of text to a jazz musician who then played the text of the opera as an instrument. It's like everybody should get to do that. Like, that wasn't about accommodating Clarence, he's a genius.
Yeah, I mean,
and that's in terms of the thing of giving up some of the creative control and like working collaboratively, kind of text and music kind of fused perfectly in what he's able to do, which was to kind of play samples of text as a jazz instrument. And yeah, I would totally recommend that to anybody. It's a really lovely way to work.
Yeah, he is an exceptional musician, you know, who was working with this sampler that he'd never worked with before. He'd never worked with text before. And, you know, like he had a quick go through and it was like, yeah, I think I'm getting it now. And then would just play these beautiful soundscapes, just live triggering stuff, and just has a fantastic sense of musicality. You sort of feel like whatever you put in front of him, he could turn it into this beautiful beautiful output. So I'm hoping that I can make those samplers so that he can load his own samples in, and then, you know, we could make a whole sampler full of trumpet sounds, or a whole sampler full of, you know, match of the day quotes, or whatever he wants, and like make his own soundscape. So that's kind of where I'm hoping that will go. But yeah, it was awesome. And it was about handing over that creative control, not having a hierarchical system, saying, you know, we are equals in this, and we'd love you to be who you are and to give us what you want to give us. And he really did. He was awesome. Yeah.
Also, just because Amble won't say it, like, I think the setting of the DWP assessment, which takes this verbatim approach, but for me, so often when you're discussing contemporary opera, there is this anxiety around how recitative can work now, or how song text can work now, and what that is. But for me, I mean, she's gonna laugh and say the reason that she's good at it is because she doesn't know anything about any of that. But the fact is that for me, what Amble's able to do with those vocal lines is simultaneously harmonically quite complicated and atonal, also really nice to listen to, and really emotionally nuanced. So rather than sometimes, not always, I mean, there's obviously a lot of contemporary opera I really love, but sometimes when you're listening to newer work, it can feel like the music has sheared off some of the nuance that you would get from listening to a spoken text in the theatre. It feels like Amble's composing magnifies that nuance. It kind of holds up to the light all of the things that people do when they speak that kind of tell you about them, and kind of that kind of that reveal their kind of their thoughts and feelings and intentions, and kind of that all of that is sort of is there, and then it can kind of slide into song and to kind of heightened levels of musicality. And so it felt like a lot of some of that stuff was, having talked about how hard some of the subject matter was, some of this like sort of wither opera stuff that people worry about a lot felt very smooth. And obviously not everyone will like it, and I'm totally up for discussing any of that, but to me that was a real joy.
And Amble, was this, am I right in thinking this is one of your first times of working with opera as a genre? How did you find that?
Oh, for sure. So I'd written this song with this kind of material before, which was verbatim that Toria had spoken about, but I kind of deliberately kept myself very much in the dark about opera, because I thought I mean I work so intuitively anyway. I do pretty much everything by ear. I mean, if you wanted me to sit down and kind of dissect what I'd done and explain it, I probably could, but that's not how I think about music. I just feel like, does it go the places it needs to go when it needs to go there? And so, I mean, Toria's right. I am going to say I could only do that because I didn't know what I was doing. I was literally just listening back to stuff and being like, does that feel right? And if it feels right, then it is right. Yeah. So I'm really not, I'm not an opera person. And even to the point I was saying to Toria, are you sure we can call this an opera? And Toria can tell you what she said back to me. But to me, I'm like, is it an opera? Is it a thing? Is it But yeah, we'll use the term opera because it's an interesting conversation to have, especially when we're thinking about, you know, one of the big key themes of this is whose voice do we listen to? Do we listen to Hannah? Do we listen to what Lynn has to say about Hannah? Do we listen to the people we've interviewed who are telling you about their lives? And when we talk about opera, that's an interesting question, because whose voices are deemed worthy of being in operas in terms of singing, if nothing else, as well as content and creativity. So this question of whose voice do we listen to is like an overarching theme, and I think that's why it felt important to call it an opera. But I'm not really the opera person. Toria's the opera person. I just make noises that I like. Toria?
I don't know. I'm only an opera person by accident of where I've ended up. I like theatre and I like music, and I like theatre that's not literal in some ways and is extremely literal in others. And I suppose I'll wait for Charlotte to tells me something about story, but like I like what opera can do and composers can do with the kind of non-literal nature of theatre. So it's an accidental thing, but I got to form a company with Linda Hurst, who is here somewhere, and so that makes me an opera person.
And I got to make an opera with them, so I guess that makes me an opera person now. I don't know.
So I think Ali just mentioned that we are like time's ticking on. It's gone really fast. So I do have a few more questions lined up, but I guess it would be really nice if anyone from the audience wanted to ask something. Like please do so. I think, Freddie, do you know if there's any questions yet?
There have been some lovely comments coming in, but no one has asked a question directly. Does anyone have a question?
I have one, if I may. I was just wondering, hi, my name's Bea, and I'm from Drake Music, and it's great to see Mahogany Opera again, because we did a training on the social model for you guys a few months ago, and this is just so exciting, and it's so great to hear about this work that's been made in an entirely non-traditional way in so many elements. I just wondered what you felt was going to come next from it.
Amble or me?
You start, I'll join in.
Okay. So for this piece, we're hoping that there will be a future life, including like reappearances online. There are parts of it. So there's a section, for those of you who've watched it, there's a section kind of near the middle of the piece where there's a chorus about disabled community that we made in the week before the show went up from things that were submitted on social media by the audience for the show. So there are sections of the opera that will be different every time that they happen. So even when it's revived online, hopefully there are developments. Also, different digital spaces and platforms and hosts have different audiences that they bring to it. So that's, you know, something that we're excited about. Also, we still hope it has a live life, not as something superior, but as something different and something for us to look forward to as people who haven't left their houses for a really long time. And we've been speaking to a theatre about that and the possibility that that then can become a place of gathering for their disabled audience in a kind of post-pandemic time, which we think could be really valuable and kind of lovely. We'd also like to see it reach an international audience, because the UK is in a predictable situation of being both the kind of best and worst of culture when it comes to disability. UK people under the current and recent governments have suffered appalling human rights abuses, some of which are in this opera, but many of which are not. At the same time that disability theory and disability culture and disability activism are really strong and highly developed and full of interesting ideas in this country. And I think that combination means that it's hopefully something that could speak to like, disabled and non-disabled audiences in other countries. A couple of very beautiful friends of the company have translated our captions into French and Spanish. So that's a thing that could happen. And then I know that for both of us, further projects and things will be inspired by it. Amble and I have had a joking conversation about our next opera, but those joking conversations are sort of doomed to become things that we end up doing, I think. And I'm also exploring the possibility of a piece that for me personally has come out of this for another platform, in terms of writing a song cycle that might explore a non-disabled character that kind of dissects abled experience in a way that I feel like doesn't often get. One of the things that we're trying to do with the character of Lynn that feels like it's developed further for me is that during over this year as well, I think people have realised that you can't address racism without dissecting whiteness rather than just focusing on a minority experience. I don't think you can really address the social injustice faced by disabled people without dissecting the idea of abledness and able-bodiedness as well as the idea of disability. So that's something that is developing further for me into another project, possibly. Amble?
I think the thing that I would really like to take forward, in addition to what Toria's talking about in a really concrete way, is a way of working and validating a way of working and being able to say, do you know what, I didn't get out of my pajamas for the whole thing, but I wrote an opera. And that's not like a me personal thing, that's a everybody thing. So that, you know, so many calls we see for artists are like, oh, it's an intensive 10-day workshop. And I'm like, well, there's no point applying for that. So being able to take the way that we worked and present it as a valid way of making work, and working with other ensembles to look at what structures they use and why those structures might be difficult for disabled people to engage with, and redesigning ways of working that allow disabled people to have a real voice within other organizations. And my cat's about to jump out the window, sorry. Within other organizations and other projects and other ways of working. I think for me that's where I would like to take this in terms of like my academic work. I will be writing about this as an experience and looking at how we can actually rethink what we mean by work and what boundaries we put on that, which we don't actually need to be there, and prevent disabled people from sharing their experience with us. And looking at the value of disabled experience as being part of an artistic community, and not just being like, oh, we'd better get some disabled people in here because they never get to do anything. But these people have got really important and useful things to tell us, and we should be creating environments where these people are sharing their life experience with us, and it's helping us produce better work. So I think that's what I'm excited about. Yeah. And making another opera with Toria, obviously, touring the world, having like flowers thrown at me every night, wearing ball gowns, all that. Yeah. Just going to rescue my cat. She's about to jump out the window and I'm in the roof, so I'll be back.
I was just wondering, Charlotte, just looking at Ava and Nancy's questions, which seem quite similar, but they seem to pick up a little bit on what Amble was just saying.
Yeah, let's have a quick look at the questions, because it's quite hard to read them and talk at the same time.
Have a look at Ava's question and Nancy's question.
Okay.
And I think they follow on quite nicely from what you were just saying about how you can now apply what you've done with this project more broadly. What can other companies do who want to be more inclusive?
I mean, I think it goes back to this idea of not thinking of the structure and the practice first, but thinking as a kind of people first way of doing things, which is very much a big kind of component of disability theory. And thinking, you know, what stories do we want to bring, and what can people bring to us. And if somebody can only bring a Tuesday afternoon to you in their pajamas, that doesn't mean we can't still listen to their voice. So it's about thinking about who you want to listen to and how you're going to work with them, and asking them and being prepared to do it, because that's something else we see. I mean, it comes up in one of the quotes, is that quite often you get asked what accommodations you want, and then bigger organizations like universities and businesses, they'll sort of try and give you half of it. And it's like, well, no, actually, if I don't have all of that, there's no point doing this at all. It's not, you know, so that idea of actually being willing to strip back all of your assumptions about how things have to be done, and saying, you know, as a group, how can we do this so that nobody is compromising in an uncomfortable place. And, you know, also there's this idea, one of the things that really bugs me is the idea that you would put disabled people in positions of leadership or disabled people on the board to train them up, as if the disabled people are the people who need educating. So we have to learn abled ways of doing things, and that's kind of a favour to us. And I kind of think, yes, disabled people absolutely should be on the board, but it's because we can share with you ways of doing things. So it's about that dialogue. It's about not seeing it as an opportunity for the disabled person, but seeing it as an opportunity for other people to hear a voice that they might not have heard, and to see a way of thinking about the world that might completely blow their mind. And so I think there's a kind of like a mental shift that has to take place in terms of hierarchies, but there's also like this willingness to actually restructure what you're doing and build it from the materials that you have, which is what can people give me. And then I think for me the third thing would be about flexibility. And like I said before, you know, we always had this knowledge that at some point something might go wrong, somebody might get sick, somebody might not feel comfortable with a certain bit of work, you know, somebody's assistant might not turn up, somebody's Zoom link might not happen, and we would have to fill that gap with something. We'd have to deal with that. And I think that commitment to flexibility is super, super important when dealing, and it might be that a mum's got to pick up her kids from school, or, you know, there's a million reasons why people might not be able to sit in a room for 6 hours, but it doesn't mean that they can't contribute to the project. But it does mean that as leaders, you need to be aware of that from the beginning and have various contingency plans up your sleeve, and be completely okay with it going in that direction or that direction, and sort of gathering it all together at the end, and having confidence that whatever you've got, you can make something pretty good out of it. So I think it's about ways of working. Yeah, those are my three top tips.
I'm going to chime in and say, I think start by putting disabled people in positions where they have control and power. Like, don't feel like you have to work your way up from involving some disabled people at the kind of lowest possible level of your organization. Skip that stage and just put someone somewhere where they have some power. Ideally, then rethink which roles within your company count as people who have power, so that you're not then, I mean, if you can't do that, just put disabled person in charge, top of the tree. But if you can't, ideally, then have a rethink about who has power, so that you're not putting people into disempowered roles. You know, it can be really, if you think you have no disabled people in your opera company or your arts organisation, not only is that terrible, but also you're wrong. There are people who are too scared to disclose. Like, I guarantee it. I guarantee you have disabled colleagues. So if you don't think you do, then people are not asking for the access that they need. And so that's a slightly separate point. I'm going to go back to my previous point, which is, if you're involving disabled people as community participants, that might be great. But also think about, are you doing that because you've not given those community participants very much control over anything? And that's the easiest place to put the disabled people, is where you expect them to be grateful. And if it is that, then change what you're doing. You know, if it's an internship because you feel like disabled people need skilling up, then make sure that that's actually true, and then make sure that that person is having a great time and like actually learning things.
Always pay your interns. Next.
Pay your interns.
I mean, this is the other thing, that
money is an access issue.
Money is absolutely an access issue. If you're disabled, like I can only work a couple of hours a day, so my income is through the floor. And if anyone puts any shout out there that's unpaid or expenses only, I'm immediately excluded from it, because I cannot afford to spend my energy on something that doesn't bring money in the door. I just can't do it. And so any platform where it's kind of pay to play, or, oh, you can have the stage, but you have to raise your own funding, you're putting extra work back onto that disabled person. And I can pretty much guarantee you that disabled person doesn't have the time or the energy to raise the money to do the thing that you should be paying them to do. So always pay properly, whether somebody's disabled or not. But money is such a massive, massive barrier for disabled people, and for a lot of other minority, you know, basically if you're not privileged, money is a problem.
Yeah.
And I think opera really suffers from that, because there is so much you have to do in order to get into opera that is unpaid or underpaid, or relies on you being in London, or relies on you being in the right school, or relies on you having the right contacts. And if you don't have the money to be in London, if you don't have the energy or the physical health to be in that high school, if you don't have the parents or the friends with the right contacts, you're just not going to get your voice out there. So all of this is like super important to unpick and be like, we're excluding people merely through the fact that they can't afford to know us.
And I think, thinking about conversations that we've had with the performers in this project and with other disabled performers that I've worked with in opera, you know, the situation will not get substantially better if we view singers as kind of replaceable unless they're a major star. You know what I mean? Because if you're holding an audition and you're like, we need 2 sopranos, and you've had like 1,500 applications, and we're going to hear, you know, 20 of them sing at us for like 2 minutes before we ask them to leave the room. Horribly, you know, disabled people will feel that, all things being equal, why would you deal with their access needs? Because that's their experience. That's not them being unduly negative. That tends to be what happens, you know. Conversations about whether partially sighted people will be able to not fall off the front of the stage and so on, like, you know, it's seen as being a problem. And if people are seen as interchangeable, then why not spare yourself the problem? But honestly, artistically, the problem is treating people as interchangeable. That's the big benefit for everybody, is if we stop doing that. And if we bear in mind, for example, that a disabled artist's CV might not look like a non-disabled artist's CV, and yet they might be as good. So you might have to be willing to trust your judgment of their talent rather than go off the 30 industry positive previous credits that they've had in the last 5 years, because they probably haven't been able to do all of that work, and they will have been discriminated against by other people. And if you're relying on that track record, you are compounding that discrimination every single time. Sorry, a little bit of a soapbox moment, but
does that answer your question, Nancy?
No, it doesn't really. I mean, social prescribing is it's going to be a huge thing in the future, and particularly now we're in a post-COVID, or we will be in a post-COVID situation. And I think that our panel's lived experience should be hugely valuable to helping take that forward, and understanding the needs of people who aren't sort of, you know, don't have ableism at the front of their lives. And I would really look forward to and welcome how you might help our NHS and our care services and others be more understanding and empowered to help others through what you do?
That's a really interesting question, and I'm gonna
Can I start while you think about it?
Yeah, if you want to.
Because I have some things to say.
Should I stop you saying them?
Well, somebody sent me a GIF the other day that said, I have lots of things to say, so you might want to get some popcorn. And I was like, yeah, that's me. Okay. For me, there's some really key issues around assuming that disability and social prescribing are interlinked and interchangeable. I am a disabled composer. I'm interested in disability theory in order to make professional level work. I'm not a community worker. I used to be before I got sick. I don't want to do it. I know what it entails. I don't have the energy to do it. I'm not interested in doing it. My work isn't social work. I don't do community theatre. I don't do community arts. That is not what I do. I am a professional composer. Some people would say, oh, but you have to do all of those things in this world. But what we see is that Black people are assumed that they will take on the Black community mantle, and disabled people will take on the disabled community mantle and will advise everybody on everything. I think that's a really dangerous place to go, personally. I think if people want to be community workers and want to do community arts, that's awesome. But I don't necessarily think that just because you're disabled, you should be interested in doing that, because you're just putting people in a box again and saying, well, because you're disabled, you must want to work with disabled children, or you must want to work with arts and health. No, I don't. Just like some composers don't want to work in those fields. I personally don't. So I think that's one thing we need to get really clear, is that disabled artists is not the same as disability and the arts. Disability and the arts is looking at how the arts can work with disabled people. Disabled artists are people who are artists who have disabled issues, needs, whatever. And they don't have to cross over at all. So the other thing is, you know, that there is so much research around disabled theory and inclusion and social mobility and that kind of thing, that if you are an arts practitioner who doesn't have experience in that field, 100% go and buy yourself 20 books on it and read them all. And don't do anything with a group of vulnerable people until you have read them and understood them. Read them and understand them. Sorry. I feel very strongly about this because I see it in other arts organisations. Pressure is put on arts organisations to work with vulnerable people, or to have more disabled people, or more ethnic minorities, or people from socially excluded backgrounds. The arts practitioners don't have the knowledge, don't have the experience to do it. And in trying to learn on the job, they end up damaging people, damaging relationships. And that isn't good for anybody. And if that's where you are as an arts organisation and you don't know this stuff, please go and read 20 books on it. Please, 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 before you put in a bid to the Arts Council to say you're going to do it. Because it's just, I have seen so many disabled musicians damaged psychologically and physically. I've seen people having broken bones during rehearsals because conductors wanted to work with a disabled person but weren't prepared to give them a break, like a rest break, and they've ended up, somebody with brittle bones had a broken wrist from playing too long. So please, if you don't understand it, go and read 20 books about it. Don't work with any kind of vulnerable person if you do not know what you're doing. It's okay not to know what you're doing. Nobody's shaming you for that. If that's the position you're in, great. I'm really happy that you're interested in it, but please don't start a project without all of that knowledge under your belt, please. So that's my soapbox, and I shout now, shut Tia.
So my way of coming back to the question from that is partly no, I think it is relevant, and I think I'm very interested in developing my own expertise in this, and then being able to help other organisations, other arts organisations. Because if you don't know, an alternative or supplement to reading the 20 books is like work with somebody who does know, ask them. Social prescribing is something I feel quite ambivalent about, because not because I don't believe that artistic experiences do people a world of good and have a relationship with health, but because I have spent 20 years fighting for and not being able to receive like genuine medical, possibly pharmaceutical, possibly osteological interventions to help my health, because for most of that period, the NHS's treatment of my condition has been dominated by people who think that I just need to have a more positive attitude. And therefore, there are disabled people that are coming to the idea of social prescribing, having experienced years of extreme trauma from the idea that their contact with the medical profession shouldn't result in medical intervention. And therefore, I think I've learned a lot about the use of arts for my own well-being, but I think I've done that in an extremely difficult situation of duress that is not something that I would immediately associate with kind of help from the medical profession.
Can I just jump in? I know there's someone, Dwight's written in the chat that he'd like to add to the question. So I don't know if you want to type it in, Dwight, or if you want to say the question. I'm very aware that we're all short of time, but the conversation is so interesting. So I hope people don't mind if we run over just a little bit, but of course, very welcome to leave as I am aware of time and also aware of our panel time as well. So
yeah, so hi, this has all been really interesting. In response to this last question that's just been raised, Amble, you said that go and read 20 books, and I was really interested in the reading 20 books. I would suggest you probably read about 50, but not everybody has that amount of time. But the only thing I just wanted to say is we just need to be slightly careful about these things, because in the same way as a Black musician, I'm not the expert on Black people. I'm the expert on Dwight Pyle Gray, which is me, and so I know, and you know, my family are all Black, but I'm not the actual expert on Black people per se, and that's the difficulty that we get in. That people think that because I am Black, I know about the experience of all Black people, and so it's a difficult balancing act. And yes, read some books, get some people that you know who can help you. But whoever the lead is, say the lead is me, don't expect me to have all of the answers, because I can't solve all of the problems, because I don't know all of the answers. And that's just something that just needs to be factored into all organisations' thinking. If you're making a start on being inclusive, that's really, really brilliant. But it also needs a little bit of common sense to understand that actually the person that you got in is not the expert and will not solve all of your diversity and inclusion problems. So I just wanted to put that out there just to back you guys up. And maybe 75 books as well. So there you go.
Thanks, Dwight. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dwight. That's really, yeah, you're absolutely right. I can get on my soapbox, but actually I can only tell you what I know, and all other disabled people will tell you a different thing. So yeah, read 75 books. Do a PhD on it before you start. If you haven't done a PhD on it, don't bother. Sorry.
That's not what we want to say. Maybe, but we did get asked in an interview. We did do a press interview in which we were asked, what is the lived experience of disabled people? That's like a singular interview question which you're expected to answer in the course of a paragraph, and obviously that isn't possible. Like up to 25% of the population of the country is disabled in some way. They are not going to have a monolithic experience, personality, set of needs, etc.
Yarp. I've got a headache, hence the sunglasses. Sorry guys, I took drugs. I mean good drugs, like anyway, never mind. Not good drugs, paracetamol.
I know obviously some people are going to have to get going, but there was one there was one question I thought might be just interesting to hear an answer to. I'm just trying to scroll through and find it. It was about how you came to the visual language of we ask these questions of everybody. I don't know if you have time to just say a couple of bits on that before we wrap up.
So actually, Charlotte, this is where you come into it. A little bit. I'm going to quote you back at yourself. So when we knew that we were going to go digital, one of the first discussions and decisions that we made was about whether we would make a film and whether we would film the performers performing, because that is one of the kind of standard things that happens in, you know, digitizing both theatre and classical music performances over the last kind of year and beforehand. And a really early decision was that we didn't want to do that. And that was partly a practical thing, that making a 50-minute film is a massive undertaking, and we wanted it to be visually coherent and really good and like had really high ambitions for it, and we just didn't think that we could achieve that. Also, you know, people were isolating, so you know, we couldn't send camera people, and you know, people had to be able to do it all themselves, and it just didn't seem plausible. And then I had a conversation with you where I said, we think we're not videoing any other performers at all. And you said, no, I hope I don't misquote you, and if I do, feel free to correct me. You said that was really interesting because you didn't think that a non-disabled led company would employ all of these disabled artists and then not show them to their audience. And I did a little gasp because I think it's really true.
Yeah, put the really disabled ones on the end so everyone can see how disabled they are.
And that made me really determined not to show them, because I think it's an issue in theatre, but I think it's less of an issue with theatre, because as soon as you start filming something, you're choosing what the camera sees in a much more specific close-up way than you are in a theatre where you can just go, here are some people in a room and some of these people are disabled. If you film a disabled person while they're doing a piece about disability, you are making their disability the visual focus. And we really didn't want to do that because we're not interested in that kind of fetishization, but also because we really wanted the audience at home to be in their own body rather than kind of projected out into the kind of gaze at other bodies. It was about the same time that we settled on the title, and we settled on having the kind of interactive dance. Sorry, if you haven't watched it, don't be put off by the phrase interactive dance. It's not compulsory, and it's a very small note of the show. But we wanted people to experience it in their own bodies, and it felt like watching film does something other than that. And then the specific language of it developed with Laura, who's an amazing artist, and it's sort of had a fully collaborative and really great relationship with her about what was possible as a visual language without messing with the fact that the captions are there as captions. So anything that makes them less accessible and less useful for the thing that they are, you know, even down to you know, serif fonts or whatever is out the window. So then you're looking at what language is possible that sustains over that period of time within those limitations. I think she's an amazing artist.
Yeah, I think just going back to what you were saying about not showing disabled people, because Petra Kuppers is an academic I read a lot, and she talks about the disabled body as a spectacle, and how actually whenever a disabled person leaves their house, they are to some extent performing because they are being watched, and they're performing their disability and they're performing their experience of humanity. And in various different contexts, you have to do that in various different ways. If you're the doctor, you do it differently from how you might do it if you were employed in a job. You might do it differently with your family than you would with your friends, with your non-disabled friends. So there's like all these different layers of performance that disabled people go through on a daily basis. And I think to encapsulate that into the show would have been another enormous concept that I don't think would have brought us anywhere closer to where we were trying to get. Like Toria was saying, as soon as you watch something on a screen, you sort of disinhabit your own reality and your own space. And we wanted the audience to feel like these questions were being asked of them and that they did have to answer them as well. And what would they say if they were asked those questions? So we wanted people to stay in their body, but also not to kind of bring up that huge fear of disabled art theory, which is disability as spectacle, because that's not really what we were talking about. Yeah.
We could keep talking until everyone has left, but I would quite like to be able to say goodbye and thank you to some people.
That's basically how I work at parties.
Yeah, that has too many bad memories for me of being too late to leave.
I'm also conscious of Paul and our captioners doing an incredible job, and I have no idea how they do it, but yeah.
Fair enough. Yes, thanks guys. You've been awesome. Thank you.
Yeah,
Can we just, before we go, because of that, and I'm sorry to make them caption it, but just point out that Eluned and Karen were involved in our process and the making of the piece, as well as being here to caption tonight. I don't think we should not acknowledge that before we go.
Yes.
That they captioned rehearsals and they used captioning to audio describe what was happening musically in rehearsals as part of the improvisation process. And I had no idea that was possible. And that was a process that they brought to our rehearsals.
It was amazing.
Story as a relationship that they have. And I totally recommend it, just as a thing. Disabled people or not, have somebody audio describe your music to you as you're making it as part of an improvisation. It's amazing.
Yeah, they were really cool. And yeah, it was a really awesome experience, and definitely a great way to work, to just have somebody typing down, oh, Sonia's message saying that they were interested to her improv. So yeah, we had Steph on one end, we had Sonia on the other, and we had Eluned and Karen in the middle describing what each of them was doing. Yeah, it was awesome. It was really cool.
Yeah, well, huge thanks to them for this evening, and thank you to you, Paul, and thank you, Amble and Toria, for just such a fascinating conversation. Charlotte, thank you for guiding the whole proceedings. Thank you to the Mahogany team for being so great and organising it all. And thank you to all of you for coming this evening. It was really great to see so many people. We've recorded it, so we'll be able to send it out if you want to go back and listen to it again. I'm going to ask Amble to put together a list of these 20 books or something so that we can all get reading on that. We'll get a reading list together. And yeah, thank you all for coming, and looking forward to the next Meet Me at Mahogany in a couple of months' time, I hope. All the best to you all. Lots of love.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Bye bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Bye.